Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. Hi, online folks. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. My name is Martin O'Leary. I'm the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my late 30s wearing black jeans and I've had arguments over whether this t-shirt is green or grey, but I'm wearing a t-shirt. Yeah, stick your answers in the YouTube chat. We'll have a little thing. Anyway. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday. We offer you the chance to spend some time in our space, hot desk alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio. Might be your first time here. Can I get a show of hands? Who's new? Who's first time? Oh, good. Okay, got a good spread. This bit is for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, the University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And we offer studio space, desks, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And most of all, we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make time for collaboration. So housekeeping, feel free to move around, grab a cup of tea, there's a kitchen over there, tea, coffee, water, etc. Please don't use the microwave, it interferes with the induction loop. But other than that, knock yourself out. We have a quiet space just to the left through here, your right, my left. Anyone who needs to take a break at any point, just pop in there. Fire exits, we are not expecting a fire alarm. If it goes off, that's real. They're at the other side of the studio on either end. One of the studio team will direct you. And accessible toilets and baby change. There was actually a baby here this morning. I have said baby change every week for the last years, and there was actually a baby here this morning. So it was great. There is baby change in the corridor next to the kitchen. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this talk. Those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Those of you who are here in person, stick your hand up. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. And yes, you can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon. That is working again. Thank you, Taryn, for pointing out that it had not been working. And at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. So, our speaker for today is Jack Lowe of the University of the West of England. Jack is a geographer who designs games and interactive narrative experiences. He'll be talking today about designing games that engage with place, about what that means for the play experience, and about how different design techniques can influence that across both digital and non-digital media. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jack.
Thank you, Martin. Hi everyone, I'm Jack. So I'm a research associate at the Digital Cultures Research Centre at UE. I work in the Pervasive Media Studio, so you might have seen me around. But I'm also a narrative designer for games and other interactive experiences using digital media. So I'm here to talk to you today about designing games that engage with place. But what I have to say also has applications beyond just games too, in thinking about how you might design any kind of interactive experience that engages with place. So where am I coming from? So I have a background in academia, specifically geography and media arts. So last year I completed a practice-based PhD looking at those who design and play location-based games that engage with place. And location-based games, for those that might not know, they're games that incorporate the player's physical surroundings or actions into the gameplay via media interfaces. This is my PhD thesis. It's like 90,000 words long. I'm not going to talk in that much detail today. You're welcome to contact me if you want to read that. But yeah, I thought I'd just put it on there. So this research involved independently developing 3 location-based games that were publicly available. And kind of studying the experiences of the people that played them and like my own design process. But actually before that, in my MA research, I looked at a specific genre of video games known as walking simulators, and considering how their worlds produce a sense of place. So walking sims are games where exploring your environment is like a purposeful activity in and of itself. So I've done quite a lot of research into what it means to engage with place through games. And the academic outputs of this work focus a lot on sort of how we understand place as a concept and what games do as media. It makes contributions to like theories around located media, play, digital narratives, all those kind of things. But in this talk, I wanted to share some of the more like practical things that I think might be interesting for people that want to design interactive experiences that intend to be site-specific or engaged with place. So what I'm going to do first is give a brief overview of what I mean when I talk about place, because there's been so much written about place, both in like geography and across the humanities, but it's also a term that we use like in our everyday lives all the time. So I'm going to put it in a framework that will help us to understand how games can engage with place and what we mean by place. And then I'm going to talk through some design techniques that I think are particularly interesting for engaging with place. And I'll talk about how I've sort of encountered them in my work and learnt from that. And yeah, then I'll talk about like why games can be such an interesting medium for engaging with place. That's how I'll sort of wrap up the talk. Okay, so what are places? Let's take Perrow's Bridge, for example. You'll know it's just across the way there, outside the window. So what are all the things that make up Perrow's Bridge as a place? Well, we've got the material aspect of Perrow's Bridge. So the actual material structure and all the objects that sort of make it up. But we've got like the river itself, the land it connects to, people's bodies and clothing, transport devices, chewing gum, things that make up the surrounding view. But obviously, when we think about Perrow's Bridge, we don't just associate it with these very material things, because it has like meanings too. And perhaps like the most evocative way we think about that is lovelocks. So you might think about all the stories behind those. But you could also think about the name of the bridge. So it's named after a person called Perrow Jones, who lived in a nearby street in the 18th century. He lived as a slave. He was originally from the Caribbean island of Nevis. You might think about alternative names for the bridge. And one that I encountered recently, which I'd never heard before, was the Shrek Bridge. And now I just can't unsee that whenever I look at the bridge. So that's a meaning that people associate with the bridge. But it's also a touristic site, a commuting site. And that image on the right-hand side shows both of those things happening at the same time. So we begin to see that the bridge and the place becomes associated with the things that happen there. So we're thinking about practices now. So this might be things as simple as like walking, cycling, scootering, running, but it might be those more iconic events as well. So things like the toppling of the Colston statue or interactive artworks that happens on the bridge. So we've got materials, we've got meanings, and we've got practices. But there are different sets of these things everywhere. What makes Perrow's Bridge distinct as a place is that these things have all gathered there at the place that we call Perrow's Bridge. They have coalesced at that site. And though these things may sort of occur in other places, no other place will have that particular combination of things. So another way to think about this is to think about the idea of weaving of different trails and paths of entities that kind of weave together to produce these meshworks. And though the component threads of the meshwork may all be like similar in other places or the same in other places, each individual meshwork of a place is different. So we're getting the idea that places they're not static. Like all the components are sort of in motion and they have trajectories that some we might be able to perceive quite easily and some we might not be able to perceive. And we get the idea that it's made up of components that aren't stable or fixed. These things can be replaced and displaced. It's this idea of like an assemblage. It's a structure that things are constantly changing within it. And often we talk about like abandoned places as places that have like a sense of place. And why do we think of them like that? Like if you Google sense of place, often you see these kind of images of abandoned places. And I think it's because they really show all of these processes in action at like one time. They sort of encapsulate that, both how places are sort of becoming and dissolving on like a daily basis. So we've got places are materials, meanings, and practices that gather, weave, and assemble. And I really like this way of thinking about place because it cuts across all like the sort of historic theories of place and ways of thinking about place, throughout different theories in the humanities. And it boils it down to these like really basic components. And in this way, it also provides us a framework for thinking about how we might engage with these components through the things that we make. So how can the materials, meanings, and practices of place be engaged by games? How can games intervene in or reflect the ways that these components gather, weave, and assemble? So before I go on to talk about like specific design techniques that engage with these things, I just want to briefly introduce 3 games that I made that I'm going to be talking about in relation to these design techniques, and they were the 3 games I made for my PhD. So the first one is The Timekeeper's Return. So The Timekeeper's Return is a story-based treasure hunt designed for all ages, in which players scan QR codes to discover the hidden histories of locations in Canterbury's Cathedral Quarter. The story follows the journey of a time-traveling researcher called Mia Augustina, whose time machine has malfunctioned and trapped her in the past. By interacting with role-playing local business people and using the information they provide, players must find and scan all the QR code triangulation markers to help recalibrate Mia's time machine and help return her to the present. The second game is Canterbury in 3 Words, which is a digital treasure hunt that challenges you to discover and share stories of Canterbury written using their addresses on what 3 words. So each story must use all of the words that are in its 3-word address on the What 3 Words app alongside a photograph clue. And then other players have to use this information to attempt to work out like the locations associated with these stories. And then the final game is The Gates to Dreamland, which is an interactive audio walk set around the Dreamland amusement park in Margate. The player triggers audio diary extracts to be played when they reach all of the 5 gates located around Dreamland's perimeter. And these diary extracts describe the journey faced by Italian scientist Galileo as he attempted to publish his final book. Through symbolic and metaphorical connections to the landscape around Dreamland, the audio walk explores the obstacles Galileo faced as his eyesight and his health worsened later on in his life, and how his perspective on the world also changed. So it's ultimately about the power of the imagination in changing how we see the world, and it can be played in person or online using Street View. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the design techniques that you can use to engage with place in interesting ways through games and other interactive media. And the first I'm calling location backstories. So the way I like to think about this is imagining being next to a little kid who is constantly asking you why. Why is the world like this? And then as a designer, your job is to come up with like the most compelling answer you can provide to that little kid. So in video games, one of the key methods used by designers to create engaging environments is to ask a really simple question, which is, what happened here? And the point of this is to create environments that are transformed by narrative events. In doing this, players encounter the environments to get a sense of a much wider set of processes, a chain of events that connect to other things that are happening in the world. And in doing so, it sort of encourages players to pay attention to everything, to notice everything, because it could all be part of this wider story, this wider conspiracy. And the same thing can apply to physical places too. So by simply asking what happened here, you can create content that tells a story illustrated by the player's material surroundings. And one way you can do this is simply through research. So in The Timekeeper's Return, which was the QR code treasure hunt based in the Cathedral Quarter in Canterbury, I did a lot of research into the historic events that happened in this area. So one of the key events that shaped the Cathedral Quarter was the Baedeker raids of World War II, where the area was extensively bombed, as you can see on this map. And so how could I tell this location backstory in an engaging way? Well, through my research, I learned that there's one street in the Cathedral Quarter where all the buildings on one side of the street predate World War II, and all the buildings on the other side of the street are post-World War II because it was completely flattened by the bombing. And I was really struck by how this spatial imagery conveyed the scale of the destruction caused by the bombing. So in the QR code that's located on the street, the character Mia Augustina deliberately instructs the player to look from one side to the other, and uses like the different ages of the buildings to communicate the story. And when I spoke to the players, this was always one of like the most memorable things they remembered from the game, because it really transformed how they saw that part of Canterbury. But the answers to what happened here don't have to be purely factual. So in The Gates to Dreamland, which was the locative audio walk about the Italian scientist Galileo, the experience takes place in Margate. Galileo never went to Margate. He was an Italian scientist. So why would I tell this story here? Galileo wrote his final book in secrecy because he was under house arrest from the Roman Catholic Inquisition for heresy. And I wanted to communicate the sense of anxiety and enclosure and sort of being watched that Galileo must have felt as he was secretly trying to write this book. So by setting this part of the audio walk on this particular road, a narrow back street that's mainly used for deliveries, it's like covered in CCTV and graffiti, I drew this symbolic, metaphorical connection between the landscape around Dreamland and the events of Galileo's life. And this experience was about the power of the imagination to sort of connect everything, and even faraway places or distant times. And this location backstory used symbolic connections to achieve this effect. But one thing I'm really excited about with location backstories is those that are completely fictional. So in Canterbury in 3 Words, which was the game about finding and sharing stories using addresses on the What 3 Words app, players were encouraged to share fictional and non-fictional stories about places in Canterbury. And this one player chose to write a myth about these statues that are in a river in Canterbury. And it was one of the most popular stories shared in the game. And when I saw this, it just made me so excited by the idea that you can tell a whole story that's completely fictional, this entire fictional world, simply by using your imagination when engaging with the material surroundings around you. And simply asking the question, what happened here, and answering it in an imaginative way. So overall, this technique creates connections between different components of place: physical materials, imagined meanings, and, well, real and imagined meanings, and practices of interpretation. And it encourages players to be attentive to these details as they play, to construct an idea of how they fit into the game world. One thing to always be aware of, though, is that players are really diverse. They will have like very different interests, very different capacities, very different motivations for engaging with the place. So what they pay attention to and what they choose to interact with will vary considerably between player to player. And this is where designing multiple layers of depth into the experience can be really effective. So let me talk about the technique of actively hiding content away. So this can seem like really, really counterintuitive as a designer, because ultimately you want people to engage with what you made. So why would you hide it away? But the reality is that even if players only engage with a small proportion of that hidden content, it's incredibly powerful for them to get a sense that there's a wider conspiracy behind what's going on, like a complex world that's made up of more things that they can perceive at any one time. And it makes them feel like there's always something more to discover, that they're on the verge of discovery, and it encourages them to invest more of themselves into the experience. But of course, there's a balance to be struck here, because you don't want to hide away everything. You don't want all your most interesting stuff to be like inaccessible to a lot of people. So in video games, this is often managed by using things like lighting to naturally draw the player's attention, or by putting the most important narrative information at the choke points in the experience. The kind of points that players have to pass through. So, for example, if there's like a locked door and you need a key to get through it, you'll put the most important narrative content next to that key, because you know that everyone has to interact with it. So particularly if you're telling a story through the environment, you want the key beats of your narrative to always be like the most accessible ones, the key events the players need to be aware of to make sense of the world. But you can design layers of depth in more subtle ways too. So in the Timekeeper's Return, I was originally going to have like an extra set of QR codes that were hidden around the Cathedral Quarter, in addition to the ones that you found by getting information from local business people. But in the end, I didn't actually have time to make these. But one thing I did do was I incorporated more historic detail into the content itself. So for example, the names of all the people that Mia Augustina finds in the past and tells you about through her research diaries, they're all based on real people that existed throughout history. But also her time machine was an astrolabe, which is a medieval navigation device. And if you Google Canterbury astrolabe, you'll find that in 2005, a really rare astrolabe quadrant was discovered in an archaeological dig in Canterbury. So for those who wanted to dig deeper, they could realize that, Mia's time machine was an archaeological artifact, and actually it's connected to this real life thing that happened. In the Gates to Dreamland audio walk, this is an extract of the audio diary that plays when you're at the entrance to one of the entrances to Dreamland. And yes, believe it or not, this is an entrance to an amusement park. So here I've highlighted all the parts of the script that make some reference to things in your surroundings at that location. So as you can see, it's like absolutely saturated with references. But at any one time, a player would probably notice like a maximum of 40% maybe of these connections with the things around you. And this is purely because like when the audio is playing, they might not be looking in that direction, or their attention might just be like drawn elsewhere. But that's fine, because when they do make these connections, it's so powerful because they've discovered them for themselves, and they've uncovered this deeper meaning for themselves. So for example, you might be able to see just in that corner there, there's a sign that says Lost Island Adventure, which I sort of nod to just briefly in the script, like using the word adventure. And I think only one player noticed this, but when they did, they were just like, wow, this is like the most amazing coincidence. So I was just like looking around and I heard the word adventure and I just happened to be looking at that sign. And I suddenly realized how the audio diary was kind of connecting metaphorically to the place around me. So when you do manage to achieve that effect, it's just incredibly powerful. It will change people's perspective. So the key point here is that engaging with place is a collaboration. It's not just telling a story. So by creating an environment where the player's agency in discovering meanings behind material things is valued, it demonstrates to people how their own practices of meaning making are really important to how they see what places are. This point about agency is really important, though, because games are ultimately about contingency, which basically means uncertainty and change. Games are made on the basis that it's compelling to believe that you have agency in an uncertain world. There are many aspects of our lives where we feel like we don't have any agency, where unexpected things happen or things change. But games present scenarios that are also this mixture of expected and unexpected outcomes, but they give us agency in these scenarios in a way that is compelling. And this is an idea by the scholar Thomas Malaby, who's written really interesting stuff on games. In place-based games, places are the source of this contingency, because places are always changing. Spontaneous things happen, there are chance encounters, because so many diverse things are gathering in one place at any one time. And geographer Doreen Massey describes this as the thrown togetherness of place, and I really like that concept. So how can game designers use this unexpected, uncertain, changing quality of place to curate compelling experiences for players? So one way is to create ambiguity around the things that are considered part of the game and the things that are just considered part of everyday life, part of the chance of place. So for players, it might leave them wondering, what was actually designed and what was just, a random occurrence. And this is where live action can be really exciting in place-based experiences. So in The Timekeeper's Return, as well as the businesses who are role-playing as, the business people who were role-playing as friends of Mia Augustina, there were 3 actors that were all dressed in plain clothes that players encountered at different points in the experience. And these were Mia's research assistants. And in the game's advertising, players were directed to find this ground compass in a place called Longmarket Square. And it's a location that you can't really find on Google Maps. Like, you have to already do a bit of like puzzling to work out where it is. But then when they got there on the day of the event, they encountered Mia's research assistant, Rose, who helped players to sort of understand, like, get into the experience and like how do you scan a QR code, all that kind of thing. And then there was another actor who sort of surprised players by going up to them at certain points in the experience, mainly if they looked really lost or confused or something. And again, she was playing the role of a research assistant, but she was like emerging out of the background of everyday life. And then at the end, players actually got to meet Mia Augustina, who's the woman on the left of that photograph on the left. And the funny thing was that players actually passed this location earlier on in the experience. So it was only once they'd collected enough information to realize that this was Mia Augustina that they'd realized they'd successfully managed to help her return to the present. Ambiguity can also be designed into the content itself, not just how it's delivered. So in The Gates to Dreamland, the figurative and metaphorical language that's used in the audio diary scripts meant that when players perceived connections between the audio and their surroundings, they were often unsure whether this was just like a sort of random, spontaneous connection, part of everyday life, or whether this was like a designed connection. And these coincidences created the sense that anything could potentially be connected to anything else if you imagined it into being. And that's exactly what the game experience was trying to do. And this is related to a phenomenon called apophenia, which is perceiving connections between unrelated things. And it's the same thing that drives conspiracy theories, for example. And we all know how powerful conspiracy theories can be in producing new perceptions of reality. So overall, designing ambiguity into the experience means that players end up navigating in a state of both comprehension and incomprehension. It reflects the way that we can never know the complete totality of a place because we're always conditioned by our own filters, the knowledge we've accumulated over our lives, and also the things that we don't know. And by helping players to realize this, it reveals how our relationships with place are formed into being. We engage with places in the way we imagine them to be. And again, this is compelling because it gives players a sense of agency, the sense that they could imagine places differently. So all of this spontaneous and ambiguous place-based activity happens in particular contexts. So if you're doing anything place-based, what unfolds will be heavily influenced by the moment in which people are interacting with it, the space and the time in which it's happening. And yet many of the ways that we interact with place in everyday life, it could be like maps, sat-navs, information boards, these all create abstractions that seem to go beyond any particular moment. There's a sense of permanence or truth to them. And one of the ways we can engage with place in an interesting way is therefore to play with these ideas of abstraction, to show that places aren't just like the basic sum of their components, but they are in process. They're always gathering, weaving, and assembling. And an effective technique for doing this, for kind of playing with these ideas of abstraction, is juxtaposition. So to bring together multiple different ways of representing a place or being geolocated, or using different media types even. And as players navigate place by sort of cobbling together all these ways of situating themselves, it provokes an awareness that the reality of what a place is goes beyond any one particular method of representation or locating yourself. So to give an example of this, Canterbury in 3 Words was the game that combined the geolocation app What 3 Words with people telling stories on a Facebook group, which is where the game was sort of curated. And What 3 Words is a platform that's based on the idea that dividing the world into 3 by 3 meter squares and giving them an address that's easy to communicate helps us to locate ourselves more easily. And as a company, What 3 Words have been really keen to sort of portray the idea that, these are just random, meaningless combinations of words. But we all know that's not true, because if I were to click on the location of a house and the address happened to be like best home ever, we'd all be laughing about it, right? And funnily enough, if you actually type that address into What 3 Words, it comes up with like a suburb in Massachusetts. So make of that what you will. But in Canterbury in 3 Words, by creating a playful system where people use the address words to tell stories, players' activities showed that engaging with places isn't just this meaningless method of abstraction. Places aren't just made of these abstract signifiers, they are tied into these wider social and cultural processes too. But as well as abstracting with different methods of locating, you can also deliberately reappropriate these using whatever methods of representation you're using. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the game geocaching, which is a GPS treasure hunt where people hide containers in public places and then they put their coordinates online for other people to find. And the genius thing about geocaching is that it takes the limitations of GPS and uses them to support a more analog, hands-on, material method of engaging with places. So GPS is only accurate within about 10 meters on average, and that varies due to things like tree cover, weather, buildings, all that kind of thing. So once players reach the vicinity of a geocache, they are forced to look up from their phones or their GPS receivers and actually engage with their material surroundings, because GPS probably isn't going to take them to the exact hiding spot, and even if it did, it wouldn't show you whether the geocache was hidden under a log or on the back of a signpost. So by playing with these methods of locating yourself in a place or representing a place, you can explore the ways that we come to make sense of places. The ways we come to make sense of places are always actually in process. So part of understanding places as being in process is the idea that their assembling happens in connection with lots of other things. So if we go back to that idea of meshwork, we get the sense of places being about convergence and intersection of many, many different entities. But this idea with connection with multiple things has a really interesting relationship with narrative. So Duncan Speakman, who's a PM Studio resident, as many of you will know, he talks really well about this. So he says that even though we tend to think about locative media and interactive narrative experiences as non-linear, your experience of it is always going to be linear because the things that happen to you happened in the particular order that they happened to you, based on your choices and your interpretations. But one way you can still create this sense of connection and interconnection with narrative is to create a frame story around the experience, not just a single narrative with multiple story beats. So this could be a role-playing framework. So you are a research assistant and you're responsible for helping Mia Augustina return to the present. Or it could be a scenario. So this researcher is traveling through time and she's sending back stories of what she found in the past using QR codes. And even though your journey through the experience might be individual, you still have to reconcile your role with the role that you're given. And so your own individual journey is somehow juxtaposed to this role. And in doing this, it starts to make you think about all the other different paths that you could take, all the wider things that influence how you act, how you think, all the other different perspectives of place that must exist within that meshwork. But it doesn't have to be just about playing a character in a story, because another type of narrative framework you can use is to create authoring environments for players to construct their own stories of place. You have to be quite careful about how you do this, because if you just ask people to share their stories of place, a lot of people really won't find that engaging, as much as I'm a geographer and I love talking about place. People generally don't want to do that. But if you create some rules around this activity, people are really keen to push the boundaries of those rules. You end up not thinking what story can I write? You end up thinking, how can I use these limitations or how can I work within these limitations to create something that's still really interesting? It becomes a source of inspiration. So in Canterbury in 3 words, players that wrote stories really found inspiration in using the 3 words of the What 3 Words addresses. So this player in particular was really drawn to poetry as a way of doing this, because he'd find that the individual words, he'd be inspired to write a line of poetry from them, and then it's oh, how can I make this rhyme with another one? And then this player here, who wrote the story about these statues, she found that the words were really interesting triggers for sort of fictional writing about place. So she talks about one of the words was ritual, and so she created a whole idea of a mythological ritual around these statues. And though the stories were written individually in Canterbury in 3 words, by bringing them together on the Facebook group, it allowed these different paths and perspectives to converge. So 2 people could write a completely different story using those same 3 What 3 Words addresses. Or, for example, in the comments sections on people's stories, people could then go and share their own stories of place. So it really created that idea of intersection. And when I spoke to players of the game about how this experience made them feel, it really surprised me how many people mentioned this idea of sonder, which is the idea of a sort of awareness of other people's lives being lived at the same time as yours. And this is what narrative frameworks, rather than narrative sequences, can ultimately achieve, is this idea of more intersection and more extroverted idea of place. So that's all the design techniques I have to talk about today, but I just want to finish by summarizing what makes games in particular really interesting for engaging with place. So I think the thing that really characterizes what games do as media is that the way you navigate a game really strongly affects your experience of it and how you make sense of the world. So your agency is what defines the experience. And I actually think this is the same with places. So while it might seem like places are relatively static or permanent, how you tell the story of your experience of a place varies dramatically depending on how you navigate through it. So whatever you imagine it to be, or how you interpret what you encounter, what you sense in the world around you, what you notice. And what makes games compelling is that you feel you can have some agency in an uncertain world. And what better source of uncertainty, of contingency, than places? Places are filled with spontaneity. They're continually changing. And by creating a sense of agency within this, it means that the world that the player inhabits can suddenly feel that much more interesting. I also think that playing games reflects the way that we actually engage with places too, so how places are performed into being. So games create room for players to create their own connections, follow their own interests, and make their own choices, within a wider framework of game rules and like the material conditions that you're playing in. And this is the same as everyday life. So we also perform our relationship with places in connection, with different rules, different structures of authority, but also different material conditions as well, but always with the agency that we can imagine them differently. So if you're interested in delving into more of this from an academic perspective, there's more like on my website, and you're welcome to contact me if you wanted to read my PhD thesis. I'm also presenting some elements of this academic work. There's an event by the Bristol Digital Games Lab. It's 2 weeks' time, Friday, 12th of May. What's it called? Virtual Realities as Time Travel is what it's called. So I'll be speaking at that. And then next Friday, 5th of May, which is first Friday in the studio, you can try a video game that I've developed myself. So this game is called Interment. It's about a family graveyard with loads of old gravestones that you can't read properly. And basically you use an archive of historic evidence to try to work out who's buried where. And it's actually quite place-based in its like content, but I didn't really want to talk about it because it's like a puzzle game and I'd give away all like the secrets. So yeah. But in general, I'd just love to chat more with anyone that's interested in located media, games, narrative design. Really open to collaboration, and I'm really looking to do more like creative work in this space. So yeah, and I think there's a lot more room in this space and in this community for engaging with games. So I'd love to be a part of that if anyone wants to do that. So yeah, thank you. I think I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Jack. We've got plenty of time for questions. So if you're in the room, stick your hand up. I will pass you a microphone so the people at home can hear. If you're at home, stick it in the YouTube chat and Lowe will be your voice in the room. So does anyone want to kick us off? Everyone's very shy. Oh, Melissa, yeah, you're not shy.
Hello, Dr.
Hello,
Jack
Melissa.
Lowe. I would like to know what the sort of technological future of this might be beyond GPS, if you have any military knowledge.
I wish I did. Beyond GPS, that's interesting. No, I mean, in terms of the technological capabilities, I have very little understanding of what like the next stage of that could be. But I think my like philosophy in this whole kind of thing is to think beyond the individual technology and instead focus on like the experience and the emotional effect that you're trying to create. Because I think that it always comes down to this. Like you can find comparisons to location-based games in like Greek times probably. So I think it's always worth just focusing on the experience, and then the technology can be like an amelioration of that experience. But yeah, in terms of where we're going next, I have no idea, but it'll be interesting to see.
Anybody else? Well, I've got one. Oh, sorry. There you go.
So what's your opinion of games which take away from immersion in the world, like Pokemon Go, and simplify it down, but still create an immersive environment?
Okay, so when you say simplify it down, what do you mean?
So it tends to be roads and then occasional,
Right, yes.
occasional landmarks, but it's not so immersive in the way that you were speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad someone asked me about Pokemon Go. It was bound to come up at some point.
That was what I was going to ask. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's interesting. So yeah, I'm going to give an answer to this, and hopefully it will answer your question as well. So I find it really interesting when people try and make the argument that Pokemon Go kind of engages with place, or helps you engage with place like more immersively, because I don't think there's anything about the design of that game that actually encourages you to look up from your screen at any one point. And I always make the comparison with geocaching, because like geocaching gets you to that point, like where the location is, and then you have to look up from your screen and engage with the material environment around you. Whereas there's nothing about the actual like design of Pokemon Go. So for those that might not know, it's simplified in terms of like the road layout, and then you've got these things called Pokestops, which are located on landmarks. And there are also gyms where you can interact with other players, and they're also based on landmarks. So it's based on a database that's been curated by Niantic. It's owned by Google. And yeah, and it simplifies place into these kind of very distinct landmarks. But nothing about the actual design of the game encourages you to look up from the screen because all of the interaction is on screen. You've got to spin the Pokestops on screen. You've got to tap on the screen. The one thing where I think Pokemon Go is actually really innovative and interesting is actually in the social experience. So with like the raid system, for example, you come together with other players to like battle powerful Pokemon. And so this idea of actually coming together almost like spontaneously in one place and then having to interact with other people to be able to beat the raid battle. I find that really interesting because so I'm part of lots of Pokemon Go communities, and I've made like some really good friends through that method. And it's interesting because I have loads of memories of places both back where I'm from in Kent and here, where I've met someone in a place and made loads of friends in a place just through doing like a raid battle. So that's where I think it's innovative in the social experience. But in terms of engaging with place and like simplifying it, like you said, I think it leaves a lot to be desired, and it's also very sort of extractive because ultimately this database is owned by Google. So make of that what you will.
Just thinking about it a bit more. So the idea though of place-based games are great because, like you say, you interact with the real space. The problem almost is not in terms of scaling, but you could also look at it as accessible, making it accessible. That in order to actually interact with that, you have to physically be able to get to whatever city.
Yes.
Is there anything you've seen where you can sort of create like a hybrid? Because the problem with creating a new, like a digital overlay of a place is it's a lot of work to set it up and it only works in one space versus making something, I guess, relative more than absolute, maybe? Is that the sort of, so it's relative to other players or other one anchor, but it can be played almost anywhere?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think there's been some like really interesting examples of games that have done that. So one that immediately comes to mind is, well, actually it's not a game, but it's called the Deep Time Walk. And it's basically like, I can't remember how long the walk is. It's something like 3 kilometers or something. And it tells the history of like from the beginning of Earth to the present day. And it kind of scales that distance according to the distance you walk. So it's always really funny because you walk like 2.8 kilometers and like, humans haven't even like existed yet or something. So, and you can do that anywhere because it's just a length of a walk. So yeah, I do think like relativism is the way to go. There's an interesting point to make on this though, because so for example, in my PhD, a lot of it was actually during lockdown, and like a lot of people couldn't like do location-based experiences. So it's like, well, how can I do this? And so yeah, I think there's really interesting options with technologies like Google Street View. So I don't know how many people know the game GeoGuessr, but it's a game that's it's played on Google Street View. It basically plops you somewhere in the world on Google Street View, and you have to work out where you are by sort of navigating in Street View. And to me, that's a location-based game because you are using the characteristics of a location to be able to sort of, you're playing with that through like a media interface. So it fits that definition, but you're not like actually physically in that place. So I think there's lots of interesting options, both for like purely digital, but actually, not digital. And then, like you said, sort of relative methods of engaging.
We got a question from online.
It's a question from Eleanor, who asks, were there any issues for people without smartphones engaging with the games, or were you able to design to allow for that?
So could you repeat the first part of the question again?
Were there any issues for people without smartphones engaging with the games, or were you able to design around that?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So for a couple of the games, so for Canterbury in 3 Words, you didn't actually need a smartphone. As long as you could access like Facebook, you could play it, and the What 3 Words app, because you can also get that like on desktop. So for the Timekeeper's Return, that was really interesting though, because obviously that's scanning QR codes. And it's funny because I remember when QR codes were first like a thing in like, I don't know, 2011 or something. I remember I didn't have a smartphone at that time. I was like a bit behind the times, and I was like, oh my God, this is just like capitalism shouting in my face saying, get a smartphone. And and so now it's almost like, everyone has a smartphone, it seems, but obviously there are also people that don't. So with something like the Timekeeper's Return, it was actually aimed at like families and like people of all ages. So often, little kids wouldn't have their own smartphone, but you could play it in groups so that one person would have a smartphone and then they could read it out to other people. And actually, those were some of the most like interesting interactions that people had, because one person would play that role of storyteller, and then the other people would listen and like look around at the same time. So that's how I sort of got around it in that one. In the Gates to Dreamland, you only really need like an audio device that can pick up GPS, but yeah, you can also play that online using Street View as well. So yeah, it's an issue, but yeah, there are ways around it.
I've also got it's not necessarily a question, but it's more of a statement. But Jez says that the undeclared USP of Pokemon Go is that it provides an opportunity for parents to interact with their younger children as they need to be accompanied.
Yeah, that's like super true. I know loads of people that have done that. It's really funny as well because so Pokemon as a franchise, like a lot of people that grew up with it are now like, you know, in their like 20s and 30s and stuff. So you do get like a really interesting mix of ages getting involved, and yeah, families is like one of the key things in that. So yeah.
One more.
So if we look at a game like No Man's Sky, for example, the whole thrill of well, not the whole thrill, but one of the main thrills of the game is to discover a space that has never been explored. So you can't ask the question, what happened there? It doesn't have a history. You still consider that a location-based game?
That's interesting. Yeah, so but I think that's still actually designed though, because if you still have to design for a space that has never been explored before. So there's still like an intentionality behind that, but also I think in No Man's Sky I think some of the planets do have like details and stuff that like potentially could imply something, if I remember correctly. But if not, then that's also like a design decision. So maybe the designers want people to overlay their own like conceptions of what that is. So I know, for example, they have these really like exotic looking plants and stuff. And like, so it's like, oh, that reminds me of this plant, or, oh, wow, that's such a really interesting imaginative concept. So yeah, I think, yeah, with that, like, even if you're designing for a space that's like, you know, empty or somehow like ahistorical, like that is still a design decision. You can still design for that. So yeah, that would be my response.
Anybody else? I wanted to ask, actually, you're obviously a narrative designer, and the games that you're talking about have very strong narrative components.
Yes.
And then you've got something like Pokemon Go, which really doesn't have much of a narrative.
Yes.
Do you think place-based games are uniquely suited to narrative, or is it just that this is two interests that you happen to have?
I think it's a bit of both. So yeah, it is an interest I have. I think they are uniquely tailored to narrative though as well, purely because like all places have like a history in one sense, but also it kind of goes back to the thing I'm saying where like the way you navigate a place is inherently sort of like a story, like especially like walking. So there's this idea that walking is like a narrativizing process because you're drawing things into like a sort of sequence of events. So yeah, so I think just those basic ways we interact with place and the fact that places do all have like some sort of history, and even if that history is like, or not even a history, and it kind of goes back to the No Man's Sky question. It's like, you can put a narrative around any sort of like material feature. Like, is that idea of like, in like mythology, like, you know, ancient civilizations creating a myth around like a tree that has a face or something like that. And, you know, you can put a story to anything if you can imagine it. So yeah, so I think it's something about how we navigate place and yeah, the ways we, like as humans, attempt to make sense of an experience. Yeah.
Great. Any last questions for anyone? Oh, Joe Lansdowne.
It's not a question, actually. It's a great talk, Jack. Thank you. I was just responding to the earlier question around place-based games and whether you always need to be there. And I was just also thinking of like some of Blast Theory's work. I think there are other examples where people have combined a kind of online player and then people kind of in the physical space, and have kind of played about with the relationship between those two like forms of interaction. So yeah, I think that is like just another set of references that might be useful to look at.
Yeah, that's such a super great example. Like Blast Theory were like massive innovators in the space in like the sort of early 2000s, and well, they're still going today as well. But yeah, they really took that idea of like yeah, being in a place and how that hybridizes with being online in really interesting ways.
All right. Well, I think if that's all, we will say thank you to Jack. Oh no, I'm sorry. Okay, one more question.
I was kind of wondering if maybe I could just talk to you afterwards because it sounds so complicated. Because I'm outside of my comfort zone, so many miles outside my comfort zone. I've never played any of these games.
That's okay. I think that's a
Never
perfectly valuable and valid. That's a perfectly valid like.
I made a short film which was based on kids playing Elden Ring, VR Elden Ring version in the woods. that then ended up with one of them in Midsummer Night's Dream. So it was a crossover of the language of Elden Ring, which I think is quite magical, and Shakespearean language, which I don't understand.
Wow.
But my next film, which I'm really struggling with, is a board game played in a house, so that the board game, the players and the game mix with the house. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about if you've ever done anything with board games, place-based board games.
I haven't actually done much with board games. That sounds like an amazing idea.
It's a horror film as well, of course.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to talk more about that with you, actually. That sounds amazing. Yeah, the Elden Ring example, do you know what the name of that project was, if it was like a sort of project?
It was my invention. I completely invented it. I just watched some Elden Ring online. I listened to some talk on Reddit and Twitter, and I just thought, this is incredible. And also the connections between the people playing the games through the language, which was the same with my son is an actor when he was doing work with Shakespeare. And it was just, it was also wonderful.
That sounds like such an interesting example, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love the idea, especially playing it in VR, but outdoor spaces.
Yeah,
because,
and it was finding a wood that felt really Elden Ring-ish, but then the colour grading person thought I wanted things colourful in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of the sensory deprivation of being in a headset and then actually being physically in a place. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Great. Any last questions before I go? I'm not going to make that mistake again. No, we're good. Thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you.
So before you all go, if you want to stick around in Hot Desk today, find out more about what we do, please come and find one of the studio team. Studio team, hands in the air. There's loads of us here today. Great. We'll be happy to help. If you're online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Please don't forget, Jack will be showing work at First Friday next Friday. It's going to be great. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you again same time next week.